good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Thank you for watching Consider This. Tonight on the show, we're joined by Feroz Nadar, Executive Director at Global Compact Network Malaysia, which is a local network of the United Nations Global Compact, which is a call to companies everywhere to voluntarily align their operations and strategies to support the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, of the UN. So welcome to the show, Feroz.
Thank you for having me
here. Good to have you here. I guess, it's only natural we begin at a place of understanding what the Global Compact Network Malaysia is, as well as the UN Global Compact. So it was launched, I believe, in the year 2000, yes?
Right.
All right, so tell us more a little bit about what it aims to achieve.
Sure. So UNGC, United Nations Global Compact, was launched in 2000 by the then SecGen Kofi Annan, who wanted to create a compact or a grouping of private sector companies to drive sustainability. Of course, by 20 years ago, the SDGs was not in existence, so we had a set of 10 principles covering environment, human rights, governance issues, and the whole idea was to get the private sector energy to drive the sustainability agenda as a third force by itself, without waiting for regulations or demand from consumers. So in the 20-odd years, it's kind of matured, and of course, in 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals was launched, the SDGs was then adopted as the main drive for UNGC to get the companies to align towards. Okay. So globally, currently, the chair of UNGC is actually the Secretary General. And how UNGC operates is that they operate via local networks. Currently, there's about 60 local networks in 60 different countries. Each country has an official local network to kind of localize the global flavor to the local context, and also to scale up what they're doing globally to the national perspective. So here in Malaysia, the Global Compact Network Malaysia is that network. So we primarily do localization of the global programs, and we also get the Malaysian private sector involved to global sustainability narratives.
Okay.
I wonder if I can ask you about your own involvement. How did did you come from the private sector? How did you get involved?
Right.
And does anybody take you seriously? That's the second question. But we'll come to that after that. You just start with how did you get involved?
Right. So I actually got involved in corporate sustainability now about 10 years now.
Okay.
So before joining the Global Compact, I was actually global head of sustainability for a chemicals company. So I've always been a practitioner at heart. In my previous corporate life, that's how I got involved with the Global Compact Network Malaysia through various offices, and I kind of stayed in touch. And then just about 5 months ago, we had a renewal of our board of directors and a renewal of our executive secretariat. And I was asked, can I helm the executive director role? And of course, I said, well, that's great. Thank you for the opportunity. That's where I am right now. So I've always been a corporate sustainability practitioner.
Okay, the reason I wasn't trying to mock you. I mean, what I ask this because I know that, and even from the time of Karl Marx, recognizing the energy within the private sector, but driven by very different logic, right? The logic of profit, the logic of a kind of agnostic view of the world. You just get things done and by any means necessary. How do you get and convince companies to now align themselves with more ideological or cultural or moral vision of the world that's not about profit? That must be a very hard sell.
It is a hard sell. I think 10 years ago, it was an extremely hard sell. But I think, especially in the past two or just a year ago, the utopian vision of being sustainable has now closed. Because now if you look at the World Economic Risk reports, climate change and water risk are the two biggest risks for companies. So it's no more about, it's something that's going to happen in 10 years or 15 years.
It's a tangible risk,
It's a tangible risk now. So the conversation has now shifted. And also from an investor perspective, they're now breathing down the necks of private sector, saying, what are you doing for human rights? What are you doing for labor? How are you promoting gender equality? So the executives are now starting to hear questions that they would never expect as recent as 3 years ago. So now the seriousness of sustainability is starting to be more mature. So I came from the palm oil sector. So yes, I was a little bit fortunate that these issues were material issues, as we call it. So we had buying pressure, we had consumer pressure. So the whole palm oil sector kind of pivoted itself to be more sustainable. But I see this happening to the rest of the industries simply because if you look today, suddenly there's an unexpected flood here and there.
Right.
And they would have an operation there. How do they relate to that? And then if you look at now the demand of labor in supply chains, they're going beyond your iceberg which you show. They want to know what's happening behind your scenes. And this is becoming a norm for buyers.
Okay.
So to answer your question, the seriousness of sustainability has really peaked, especially in the past 1 or 2 years.
I mean, you brought up a lot of interesting things that I'm hoping that we delve into in the next 20 minutes or so. But one of the things that I do want to kind of understand, you said a little bit earlier, the local chapter is to localize global practices and bring it down locally and then also report up that way. And locally, how many companies are involved? Because it is a voluntarily an initiative that companies themselves have to sign up to.
That's
in
right.
Malaysia, how many companies do we
So
have?
in Malaysia, we have 36 companies, and this is spread with large cap.
Are
and
you happy
SMEs.
with that number?
36,000? No.
Just 36.
We are definitely not happy with that number.
Okay.
I think we can do way better. In fact, what we have recently done is that we've entered into a MOU with Martrade. We want to look at least enlisting 500 SME exporters so that they can see sustainability as a third value add for their products. We are also engaging the PLCs very aggressively.
PLC, the public listed companies,
very
okay.
aggressively to get them to sign up to our charters as well. So we project at least a doubling of this for 2020.
In about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, multinational corporations were seen as the bad boys of the world, right? The bad boys of global capitalism.
Yep.
But I imagine, I guess, that it's easier to sign up an MNC today than it would be to get somebody from the SME sector, which is the backbone of the country's economy, right? Is that true?
Spot on. Simply because I think the demand and understanding of it is very different, right? So the MNCs, they have I would say, the resource muscle to look beyond my bread and butter issues, right? And they are strategic and they are thinking about 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line. SMEs are a bit different animal, right? They have got to see, at the end of the day, it's a bread and butter issue for me.
Sure.
I think one of the issues is that we kind of we kind of use the same yardstick across the board, where we can't treat SMEs the same as the big companies. How we need to engage SMEs is from a supply chain perspective driven by the big companies. So it has to be an ecosystem that is built around this. So we are seeing more issues signing up SMEs, but that's simply because we are not talking the right language to them. And as we hope, as we go, we mature, we understand their lexicons, and we'll be able to say the right things to get them on board this journey.
All right, Feras, we're going to come back
Sure.
and continue this conversation. Sharaad, in just a couple of minutes, we'll continue and take a look at using that right language in addressing SDGs. Stay tuned to Consider This. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kutan, and we're chatting tonight to Feras Nada, Executive Director at Global Compact Network Malaysia, the local chapter of the UN Global Compact Network. So Feras, just before the break, you talked a little bit about using the right language to communicate this. And I'm just wondering whether, as a whole in Malaysia, there is an understanding of what the SDGs are when it comes to the business community.
Right. I think as a whole, at a very top level, people understand that the Sustainable Development Goals is important for business. Right?
I mean, we've all heard about it in the periphery.
We've seen the beautiful
Yes.
17 colors and things like that, right? But herein lies, I think, one of the issues with SDGs and business. It is not written in business speak. So, for example, if you talk about ending poverty, right? No CEO will disagree that, yes, we've got to contribute to this. However, how does this relate to their business? So, in my opinion, ending poverty in the business speak, for example, is everybody paid minimum wage. But however, is that enough? Right now, we're talking about living wage, right? So until and when the right words are used from a business perspective, it always be something that, it's a global agenda, but how do we plug into this?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I do want to ask you, though, when we think of something as important as the climate crisis that we're suffering, does voluntarism work? Voluntarism is based on the idea that people are much more likely to actually do what they say they're going to do if it's voluntary. that it's because it's non-coercive, it actually it coheres with our more democratic and liberal sensibilities, right? But when you have a crisis, what's your personal opinion? Do you think we can continue with this voluntaristic approach to this issue? Do you think
No.
we need?
I think a stronger action is definitely needed.
For instance, like
so
it has to be mandatory.
Mandatory, yes, of course, that is the best way to do it. But I think more important, rather than just saying that we want to do it, a commitment has to be made and publicly made. So at the global level, we have recently launched something called the Business Leaders Ambition for 1.5 degrees. We are taking this a step beyond just pledging that, yes, businesses need to go hand in hand against this climate crisis. What are we going to do for this? So there's two things that they can do by joining this pledge. One is either they set a science-based target to reduce their emission vis-a-vis their their carbon footprint. Second is they commit towards net zero, right? So the second part for Malaysian companies may be a bit difficult. However, the science-based target is very achievable. So we need to stop saying that, yes, we want to be sustainable, we have to support this. The question is how?
Yeah,
Set a target, tell us publicly.
And how would you characterize the local businesses' support and reaction towards the climate crisis? How have they responded?
I would say lukewarm. Simply because, again, we may be a bit removed from the whole climate crisis things that's happening in front of our faces. You know, right? We are, as you know, Malaysia is very blessed. We don't get this
extreme
climate kind of things. But yet. So we are a bit insulated. Therefore, we are not very proactive in working this out. We seem to be very reactive. But again, that's because we have not translated it from a strategic perspective. I think the government is doing some great initiatives in trying to predict and be a bit more proactive when it comes to climate agenda. So, for example, one thing that was recently discussed about was the Energy Efficiency Act. I think in most private sector, energy is the closest component that they can have in relation to climate, right? So once they understand that, okay, energy that we use day to day is a big component, how do we behave better in this?
And they are one of the biggest contributors, right?
Biggest contributors as well. So it has to be hand in hand for the Malaysian private sector. We are kind of like let's wait and see, or who tells us how to do it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And I wonder, you talked about the ecosystem earlier as a way of actually getting the SMEs to respond, right? Because if they're having to sell to a market like a European market where standards are very high, then they will conform just because it's good business practice, right? So is that the way that we should be thinking about, that there will be in this world leaders who are going to set standards and who are going to maintain that in a mandatory fashion, not a voluntary one, and everybody's going to have to follow. But is there a role for Malaysia to become a leader, for SMEs or businesses here to think of themselves, other than just followers, to think of themselves as in a leadership position?
Right. I think to your first point, I agree. You know, at the end of the day, private sector is very incentive-driven, whether it is the carrot or the stick, right? So when there is a standard set by a big buyer, yes, everybody would conform. But does Malaysian companies have a role to be leaders? I absolutely think so. Of course, it's sectorial. We can't be leaders in everything. For example, like the palm. I think naturally we are seen as leaders in sustainable palm oil, right? Usually when you say you're buying from a Malaysian palm oil company, the perception is a rather less risk compared to buying elsewhere. But I think there's also new domains that we can look at. So for example, like the electronical industry, now human rights is a big thing. Right. How can we be setting the scenes as leaders in terms of good governance in supply chains and things like that? So that it is possible, but I think the issue is that what is the standard of leadership when it comes to sustainability? There are many different caveats or understanding of this is how you be a leader, or this is the framework, this is the scoring, this is the methodology. So what is the right standard? I think that's something that is still being discovered. Yeah.
Right, but also, I mean, what is the right standard in measuring a company's impact on SDGs, right? There's no standard metrics that measure the impact of a company's SDG compliance in a way.
Or is there?
Or is there?
I mean, there are a number of ways that is measured. I feel if the PLCs in Malaysia, they use the FTSE for Good as a benchmark.
As benchmark,
right?
okay.
Globally, you know, they've got the Dow Jones Sustainability Index as a benchmark. But again, how then do you drive this across the supply chain? You can't hold a Dow Jones standard to a SME.
Correct.
And as you correctly mentioned out, they are the backbones of our economy. But the SME will ask, do I follow buyer A or buyer B or buyer C? So this is something that we've had in discussion with a number of government agencies. What is a right sustainability standard for the private sector? It's something that we are exploring. But in my mind, we don't need to create this. There are a lot of existing standards out there, whether it is from a certification viewpoint or as a voluntary basis. So we need to pick what matches the Malaysian narrative and set that as an example for us to follow.
What about the possibility that imposing these standards will actually increase costs and make our goods and services less competitive? I mean, is there a fear that you're actually going to be adding costs to production and that going to be a disadvantage?
I mean, anything new will definitely add a cost. And I think that's one of the biggest hindrance for private sector to embark on being sustainable. At the end of the day is, what's my ROI for
financial
doing this,
lens,
the financial
right?
lens kind of things. But I think the issue is that we are not putting financial lens on things that we don't traditionally treat as a P&L issue, right? So when a risk happens that you cannot sell to a particular market because you are not conforming to human rights issue, now what is that opportunity lost for not being able to do future business? If you look at the palm oil sector, if you don't have the RSPO certificate, many buyers don't want to buy for you, and that's a loss of opportunity as well. So I think there is an investment, there is a cost, but it must be treated as an investment. It must be seen that way.
Well, that's a tough sell. We're going to come back and continue. I have a follow-up question for that, but we have to take a quick break and we'll be right back. So don't go anywhere. Stay with us on Consider This. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kutin and Feroz Nada from Global Compact Network Malaysia. So just before the break, we're talking about the financial lens that businesses measure everything or see everything through. And I'm thinking about investors, right? Especially for public listed companies. Because of the short-termism of investors looking at P&L for every quarter, it becomes difficult for businesses to invest, as you said, into sustainable practices. When you're talking to businesses, how do you help them navigate this?
Right. So they say there's two sides to everything.
Sure.
So for us at the Global Compact, we see this as a great opportunity as well. The whole DNA of a company that's fiscally driven, right? So recently we've launched a platform, an action platform called the Sustainable Financing Platform, in which we want to motivate and influence the entire private sector to pivot towards being sustainable via financing instruments. So for the first time, we are trying to engage CFOs directly to come together to develop a global principle of sustainable financing from a non-financial institution perspective. The whole idea being is that when private sector makes their decisions or want to grow, they usually raise debt. It's either they borrow money or they issue their own corporate bonds and things like that. So recently at a global level, we helped Enel. Enel is like the energy company of Italy, to launch something called the SDG bond. The primary difference between an SDG bond, or rather how we see it, and a green bond is that a green bond is project driven. An SDG bond is your entire business strategy is now pivoting towards becoming more sustainable. So what Enel is saying is that we are only going to be a renewable energy company. And we are betting that we are going to be more profitable by becoming more sustainable. And they launched, and they raised about $4.5 billion from the ESG investors who have big appetite for this. And they actually priced their bond higher in market.
And there was still appetite for that.
And it was still 3 times oversubscribed. So we can take that financial narrative and turn it to our advantage if you are strategic about it.
Right. It seems very creative, and I love these kind of vanguard projects because it tells you about what the future could be like.
Yes.
But when time is ticking and the clock is ticking, as it were, on the planet, the issue for me is what is the critical mass that you need to actually make all these little types of new ways of thinking be substantial in its impact on the planet, right? So, in particular, what level of sign-up do you need in a Malaysian sense for it to have impact, on a global sense to have impact?
Yep. So, there's a very interesting chart that was making its round on the social media. I know there's only like 7 companies that rule the
yes.
consumer world or something like that. Right?
Yes.
Now, this also shows that how much power they wield, sometimes independently from sovereign nations. Right? I always believe that a sustainable business is a business that has profit, because the profit will result in power. What's important is how this power is wielded, and this is driven by the corporate values of the organization. So when somebody who has large supply chains are able to influence the suppliers to become more sustainable, that is the key thrust to move forward. As much as I like to say, it has to be a bottom-up kind of thing, but because of the time crunch that we don't have the luxury of waiting for everybody to rally and we want to do. It has to be hard-hitting decisions for the guys on top saying that, look, I want all my suppliers to fall the line in this. And we don't have to look far. Look at palm. Palm oil is the perfect example of this. How has this worked out? If you look at RSPO, within a span of a decade, how much influence it has grown simply because the big buyers were saying that I want sustainable palm. Of course, I'm not going to go into the narrative that this is a trade war, blah, blah. Let's look at how sustainable that entire industry has become from what the suppliers, downstream perspective, and also the upstream, because the consumers want sustainable things as well. So we have a working model. We just have to pick it and put it across the board.
So you keep using palm as an example. What's the next industry that you see may follow palm's direction?
In the Malaysian context?
Yes.
I think electronics will be the next, simply
okay.
because human rights and labor is now becoming a big issue. They want to know that there's no forced labors, there's no things involved. So how is this going to take in place? Of course, manufacturing would be in that ambit.
Right.
I think if you look at all the glove providers, they have been shocked recently by certain things. They would be the next in line for this. Okay. But again, I want to repeat, we always think about being sustainable as something that, we have to recreate the entire strategy. It's not. We already have success cases in the palm. Learn, adopt. Also, I think from the C-suite or even the practitioner level is that many good things that businesses do will relate to SDGs.
Yes, yes.
There's no need to recreate.
The SDGs kind of cut across best practices across industries.
Exactly.
I just want to very quickly pivot to an area of the SDG, which is what I'm passionate about, which is the gender equality dimension.
Right.
Can you touch a little bit on that and how local businesses have responded in aligning to that dimension of the SDG?
Just before that, I just want to say there's 4 key things that private sector needs to do in being sustainable. One, they need to decarbonize their production process for climate change issues. The second is they've got to ensure decent work for all. Third is ensuring gender equality. And third is good governance and ethics. Because studies have shown if there is gender equality within the private sector, the GDP growth is already substantial, right? So right now, the private sector, the way I see it, is depending on the regulation that they must 30% quota on the kind of things. So they are pivoting towards on things like that. But I think beyond that, we also need to understand what are the underlying baselines from a gender equality perspective that private sector needs to embark on. So for Global Compact, a number of years ago, we've launched something called the Women Empowerment Principles, WEP, which is quite a comprehensive baselining assessment for private sector to self-assess, to say that, we have gap here, gap here, gap here. This is how we can close the gap.
Okay.
So we have this methodology and tools that private sectors can use for free. But the most important thing is that it has to be a strategic agenda.
Gender-wise, how's Global Compact itself as an organization? How's it doing?
So our ED is a lady. We have a number of senior ladies.
This is at the global UN level. Yes.
At Malaysia, our chair is a lady. Right? So we are also looking at the 30% quota as well. So we want to promote these kind of things. In fact, what we want to work with our local partners is how do we drive gender equality within our members, right? It can't just be 30%. It must be beyond that. So we want to now deploy our methodologies across the board so that they can use it as baselining, gap analysis, and how do they move forward on this.
All right. Well, in the last minute that we have left, earlier you mentioned that the goal for 2020 is to double the number of companies involved with the Global Compact Network Malaysia. How exactly are you going to achieve this? Because we're going to hold you to it and call you back on the show.
No, I think at the end of the day is private sector want to ask, why should I be part of this? What's in it for me? So we are now strengthening what we are giving for our members. Of course, taking cue what we're doing globally. Locally, we are now deploying several digital tools that members can use to enhance their sustainability journey. I think another important thing also, we also want to create a few Malaysian champions that can contribute the Malaysian voice to this global narrative. It's always a very global not thing. It's not wrong, but I think in the century, which they're saying is our century, it's time for us to step on the plate and say, this is how we should also do this kind of things. So we're working with a few potential Malaysian champions in this space as well.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have on Consider This for this episode. Thank you so much, Ferris, for being on the show. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off. With me, Sharaad Kuttan. We will be back same time tomorrow, 10 p.m. for another episode of Consider This. Thank you for watching and good night.